Let's welcome our first speakers, Jazlyn Lee, EPR Regional Coordinator for WWF, and Yvonne Lin, Materials Expert for WWF Singapore. Started by WWF Singapore, Plastic Action Pact is a business initiative that aims to eliminate plastic pollution in nature and move towards a circular economy on plastics. It recognizes the integral role that businesses play to solve the issues of unnecessary use of plastics and plastic pollution. Jazlyn drives WWF's initiative on no plastic in nature by 2030 and is responsible for extended producer responsibility EPR engagement with businesses and governments in 6 countries in Southeast Asia to build a collective action and systemic approach to address plastic pollution. Introducing Yvonne. Yvonne's role as a materials expert aims to guide businesses towards sustainability by providing consultancy on the materials' impact on the environment. Over to you, Jazlyn.
Hi everyone. Hi, I am the Southeast Asia EPR Regional Coordinator. I'm happy to be here to share with everyone some of the key insights in regards to extended producer responsibility. I'll be sharing with everyone as well some of the key findings and key recommendations from some of the recent studies published in several countries as well. So addressing plastic pollution is no longer a choice, as everyone is aware, and it is affecting each and every one of us, especially during the lockdown due to the pandemic crisis, where more people opt for ordering food online due to the concern of health and safety concern. And of course, there's also an increase of e-commerce delivery due to the pandemic lockdown situation as well. So, for example, according to the Thailand Environment Institute, the plastic waste has actually increased from about 1,500 tons to 6,300 tons per day last year, for example, owing to the soaring home deliveries of food and other items as well. So as you can see from here in this chart, even though, for example, the packaging are actually very light in weight comparing to other plastic-related products, for example, textiles, building constructions, electrical appliances. So the packaging waste actually dominates the global plastic waste generation by weight, as you can see from here, which is over 140 million tons, and this is in 2015. Unfortunately, there's only about 14% of the estimated plastic packaging is actually recycled globally, and only 2% is reused as high-quality recycled input. And of the remainder, about 14% is incinerated, and 40% is landfill. So the recent movements on banning the plastic straw is actually only solving the problem that is on the tip of the iceberg, because there are a total of about 8 million tons of plastic flow into the ocean every year. And the plastic straws only comprises of just about 0.025% of that. Hence, that is why for a new future state, we need to look into redesigning the production consumption waste model in order to close the loop through reduction, for example, improve packaging design, product design, encourage reuse and recovery and recycling of material. So in order for us to achieve a closed loop model, for example, companies, especially the consumer brands, will really have to be more committed when it comes to the reduction of material use, improve their packaging design, for example, by switching from non-recyclable packaging to recyclable or even easy to recycle materials. At the same time, they need to also encourage reuse of packaging and also their products in order to ensure that the material recovery can be improved. And of course, we also need to have a very stringent regulations on plastic waste by the government, and to also increase consumer awareness to ensure that as a consumer, they also need to practice, for example, waste segregation in order to ensure that whatever that is recyclables can be further processed for material recovery by the recycling industry. So what is extended producer responsibility scheme? For decades, for example, the waste management system has always been the sole responsibility of the public sector as well as the government. And of course, the system has proven to be inefficient. So hence, that is why some of the developed countries, they have implemented extended producer responsibility scheme in order to address some of the key causes and key factors of plastic pollution in their country. So what EPR really means is by shifting the responsibility and cost of products and packaging and of life management from the public sector, from the government to the producers and the importers as well. So this can be done by encouraging improved product design, encourage reduction of material use, encourage reuse models, increase the recyclability of the products and the packaging. And by having this in place and by having these practices to be implemented by the producers, this can then reduce the environmental impacts of the plastic waste generation as well as the packaging waste generation. So the producers as well as the importers, they will have to contribute the EPR fees to a producer responsibility organization as a system operator. So the EPR fees is very different from the tax and the public fees because the fees are actually not collected by the public fiscal authorities. It has to be a standalone source of income to really improve the waste management infrastructure as well as the recycling infrastructure in the specific country. So for what I'll be sharing with everyone, some of the key findings from recent studies published in several countries. So the first study that I would like to share with everyone is the study on EPR scheme assessment for packaging in Malaysia. So this was published last year in September by WWF Malaysia. So there are three significant characteristics that we are looking at when it comes to the waste management system in Malaysia. So most of the high value recyclable packaging are already separated from household waste to a very relevant extent. And this is especially applied to rigid HDPE, PET, and PP materials. So these are actually highly recyclable materials that can be further processed by the recycling companies based in Malaysia. And of course, the extraction of the recyclable materials are largely informal, and the subsequent value chain is actually based on a functioning market. So the second key finding is that the Malaysia's recycling capacities are actually sufficient for locally generated plastics and packaging waste. However, a huge number of recyclers and aggregators, they actually import the plastics and packaging waste from other countries to further process, occupying large capacities of the recycling capacities for this group of recyclers in Malaysia. So why are they importing most of the feedstock from other countries? This is mainly because most of these feedstocks are usually less contaminated, and of course, they are also usually available in large quantities as well. And the third key finding is that the low value and non-recyclables are actually disposed together with other general waste, especially to the landfill. So when it comes to the material flow analysis for post-consumer plastic packaging waste in Malaysia, the study estimated of about over 1 million tons of plastic waste generation in 2016. So as you can see from here, the recycling industry in Malaysia is fairly developed and produces about 1.5 million tons of recycled resins every year, which are approximately 4.5 billion ringgit in revenue. So most of the rigid monomaterials, for example, the HDPE, PET, and PP materials have a very strong existing recycling market in Malaysia, mainly because they are easier to collect and higher weight and value per piece. So polypropylene, for example, PP, has a wider range of accepted materials for recycling, including clear and colored packaging of food, takeaway food containers, and non-food related packaging as well. However, for other packaging materials like LDPE, polystyrene, PVC, and other packaging materials, even though the recycling market industry in Malaysia, they do have the capacity to process these kind of materials, especially the flexibles, films, sachets, for example. However, most of the feedstock for the recyclers are actually from industrial and commercial sector, and they usually do not accept these kind of materials from household waste, mainly because they are highly contaminated. They are not properly separated from other general waste. So hence, they are not using the feedstock, the LDPE or polystyrene PVC post-consumer waste from household generated waste for this specific reason. So next, I'll be sharing with everyone the key findings for the EPR scheme assessment for plastic packaging waste in the Philippines. So the first key finding is pretty similar to Malaysia, where most of the high-value recycled packaging are already separated from household waste to a very limited extent. So this was done mainly by the informal sector as well. And of course, this is also applied to similar packaging like rigid HDPE, PP, and PET material. However, the recycling capacity of the Philippines are insufficient for the locally generated plastic packaging waste, mainly because there's a lacking of uniformity of in implementation of national regulations. Recycling infrastructure is also very limited. For example, in Philippines, there are over 7,000 islands, and the smaller islands are actually not connected to the main islands. And this can only be accessed by boats, mainly. So there's no centralized waste collection in these islands. And the third key finding is that the low value and non-recyclables are also usually disposed of together with other general waste like food waste. So there's no systemic separate collection for low value packaging. So when it comes to the material flow analysis for the post-consumer plastic packaging waste in Philippines, so Philippines, they consumes of over 2 million tons of plastic products every year. And however, the current law and policies on waste management are actually not being adequately or properly implemented. And there's also lack of proactive and innovative approaches to deal with the waste or even at its source, for example, improving the packaging design. So out of the over 2 million tons of plastic waste that are generated, only about 35%, for example, 35% are actually leaked to the open environment, while 33% are disposed to the landfills. 60% are still in store or in use by consumers or in the market, and only about 9% are actually considered as recycled in Philippines. Whereas for Vietnam, currently in Vietnam, most of the municipal waste has not been separated as source of generation. So for example, this is also pretty similar to the case in Philippines and in Malaysia, where most of the high value recyclables are being separated by the informal sector. However, the recycling capacities in Vietnam are insufficient for the locally generated waste, as well as for the high value recyclables. And last but not least, the packaging waste management realities is very different across Vietnam. For example, some of the rural areas, they don't even have any form of waste collection, leading to high practices of illegal dumping as well as open burning in some of the rural areas to manage their packaging and their plastic waste. Here, as you can see, the material flow analysis for post-consumer plastic packaging waste, the plastic share in Vietnam municipal waste is estimated at about 13% growing tendency. And significant volumes of plastics are still remain uncollected, unfortunately, especially in the rural areas of Vietnam. And they are usually burned openly or being dumped to some of the illegal dump sites. So, and there's an estimated amount of about over 700,000 metric tons of plastic products are generated every year. And very high portion of the generated plastic products and packaging waste are actually not properly collected and being processed or further treated in the recycling industry sector. So this is for some of the characteristics that shape the waste management system in Indonesia. So the Indonesia's population is expected to grow from, for example, 260 million people to about 310 million people in 2040. So the economic growth is actually expected to lead 35% of increase in waste generation per person by 2040. So there's one study also acknowledges that there's a huge differences in the waste management facilities in different areas across Indonesia. For example, the average plastic waste collection rate is pretty high in mega cities such as Jakarta, about 75% compared to 20 or even 16% in rural or even remote areas in Indonesia. And the third key finding is that the collection is actually not very well funded, both from the capital expenditures as well as to cover the operational expenditures by the municipality operations in very specific areas. And the study also found out that the waterway waste composition has greater proportion of low value packaging than municipality waste. What do we mean by the low value plastics are actually the sachet, the flexibles, and also the films generated from household usage. So when it comes to the material flow analysis for post-consumer plastic packaging waste in Indonesia, there's the average plastic waste collection in megacities is about 74% comparing to about 20 to 16% in rural or even remote areas. So, and as you can see from here, there's only about 10% of the plastic packaging are actually recycled in Indonesia, and over 60% are actually leaked or leaked to the environment through dumping on illegal sites, for example, open burning, or even leakage to the sea and other waterways. So the study also proposed EPR scheme as one of the financing tool. So with the additional and stable funding from the EPR system, the waste collection in Indonesia could be expanded, especially in the rural and remote areas in Indonesia. And the material recovery facilities could then be utilized to process more recyclables before sending the collected recyclables for further treatment, for example, mechanical or even chemical recycling, etc. So, however, it is not as simple as adopting EPR scheme from other countries and applying it on a standardized manner. It has to be crafted carefully to address some of the local issues to gain maximum benefits out of it. So what we propose is by having a mandatory EPR scheme, this is to ensure that there's a reliable financial basis for a large-scale collection, and this is also to avoid the issues of free riders. And we also propose inclusion of different packaging materials, including plastics, paper, metals, or even other materials from household or even equivalent places of origin. So why are we proposing inclusion of different packaging waste? This is to ensure that there's no negative substitution effect happening in the market. And we propose one nonprofit producer responsibility organization as a system operator to run the EPR system in the country. And there has to be a modulated fees to ensure that to stir the recycling market, for example, through the application of reduced EPR fees for high-value recyclable packaging, while by having an increased EPR fees for low-value or even non-recyclable packaging to be paid by the producers and by the obliged companies. And of course, there is a need to have a very strict monitoring and control system to avoid fraud, strict and enforcement monitoring, especially from the governments. So this is what it looks like when it comes to the EPR scheme implementation. So the system operator, which is the producer responsibility organization, they will have to communicate with different key stakeholders. So they will accept or they will collect EPR fees from the producers and importers. They will then channel the collected amount of EPR fees to improve the packaging design and to expand the waste collection rate by subcontracting or by working with the waste management operators. And at the same time, the producer responsibility organizations, they will have to communicate with the consumers by creating awareness to ensure that they are practicing proper waste segregation for their post-consumer waste. So this is what it looks like when it comes to the EPR implementation timeline. So within the first 1 year, we are encouraging multi-stakeholders consultation and roundtables especially between the government as well as the industry players. And then we can talk about establishing a voluntary producer responsibility organization to take up some of the pilot projects and to also start the direction of EPR implementation by having discussions with the government. So within the first 3 years, then the government can look into drafting and establishing a legal framework for a mandatory EPR system to be implemented in the next few years. And within 5 to 7 years, that is when we can talk about the rollout of a mandatory EPR system, shifting from a voluntary producer responsibility organization to a mandatory PRO. And then within the next few years, that's when we can talk about further improving the EPR implementation mechanism, improving targets, for example, and even to reach out to other smaller companies as well, to also ensuring that they are also contributing and participating in the EPR system on a national level. So, of course, when you talk about EPR schemes, that is when you also talk about a collective action from different key stakeholders, and requires responsibilities and roles of different key stakeholders to ensure that we'll be able to get the maximum benefits out of the EPR system that have been implemented on a national level. So here, the producers of the packaging can encourage reuse or use more secondary materials in the packaging, whereas the consumer goods company will then pay for the EPR fees to the producer responsibility organizations, improving their packaging designs and their products. The retailers, where they can organize take-back obligations by encouraging the consumers to bring back some of the recyclables for further processing. Consumers will then have to sort and dispose that packaging waste correctly, practicing proper waste segregation, whereas the waste management operators, they will then get additional funding and resources from the producer responsibility organization to improve or expand collection coverage and also to improve the sorting facilities. then the government will have to come in to really monitor the whole EPR system implementation by working with the producer responsibility organization. So that is all for my presentation for today. I will then pass it over to my colleague Yvonne to further share with you some of the other key findings on packaging materials and how do we improve the packaging designs and the products as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jazlyn, for the introduction on EPR. I'm Yvonne, material expert from WWF Singapore. In this second half of the presentation, I'll focus on the EPR journey in Singapore and the 3R plan that is part of the packaging reporting scheme. Before I go on, I'll give a bit of background on the packaging problem in Singapore. So in Singapore, according to the government statistics, about 1/3 of the domestic waste consists of packaging waste. Out of this packaging waste, 55% was found to be plastic packaging, while 25% was paper, and the remaining 20% was made up of other packaging types of such as metal and glass. Unfortunately, in Singapore, the recycling rate is not very high. For plastics, it's only at 4%, and for paper, it's currently 38%. So some of the challenges we have in Singapore is that a lot of the packaging waste is a post-consumer, which is contaminated and hence cannot be recycled. So currently, these are being incinerated instead. Another challenge in Singapore is that we do not really have a lot of recycling facilities here within Singapore. So although recyclables are being collected in Singapore, this is actually mostly exported to neighboring countries. So currently in Singapore, the EPR has not yet been implemented. This is targeted to be implemented no later than 2025. So before that, the government actually came up with this mandatory packaging reporting framework, whereby producers of packaged products such as brand owners, manufacturers, and importers, as well as retailers such as supermarkets, will be required to submit a packaging data and a 3R plan to the National Environmental Agency. So why this is important is because there is a need to know what is the type of packaging that is being put out into the market, and also what is the amount that is being put into it. So this is currently targeted, this framework is currently targeted at companies that has a $10 million annual turnover. So having such a data will lay the foundation for the EPR in future. And the 3R plans that is part of this MPR framework is to raise companies' awareness to the benefits of packaging reduction and to let companies know how much packaging that they're really using. So I have over here below some of the 3R plans that is actually being shared by the government that can be constituted as part of the 3R plan that the companies can consider. So I will actually try to go into a bit more details in my following slides. So we'll start with looking at packaging reduction. If your packaging type is actually quite a common one, such as, for example, PET bottles, it's quite actually easy to find some kind of benchmarking or some kind of guidelines, as the one I've shown here at a screenshot. So what happened is that you can just easily do some kind of material worthiness reduction or removal of some unnecessary components, and it will help to reduce the weight. But of course, packaging has that function where you have to, protect the product that it is holding, and so therefore the packaging integrity is very important. So there is a maximum lightness or reduction in the wall thickness that you can go, and such guidelines is actually be available in the internet if you do a quick search. So of course, another way is to change the material just to reduce the overall weight. But the difficulty comes in if your packaging type is not a very common one. So for example, in e-commerce, this is where the amount of products that's been sent out per parcel can vary from size, in terms of shape, and in terms of the material. So this is where you need to come in with some kind of redesigning, testings, and testings whether your product is being protected by the packaging, and then do some kind of redesigning again, go a few rounds and before you can reach the final design. So this is where it can be a bit more challenging for such non-uniform packaging products. And of course, if your company has many products with such different size and shapes, then of course, then you will need to do a lot of redesigning. A next point under the 3R plan that companies could do is to do reuse and recycling. So in terms of reuse, this is actually the most ideal scenario in terms of the environmental footprint, but it's also the hardest due to the amount of logistics that is involved. When it comes to, say, B2B packaging transports, and those kind of scenario can be slightly easier because from one warehouse A, you deliver another product to warehouse B. You could unload your item, and the empty cartons or pallets could then be returned immediately back to warehouse A. But it can be very, very difficult when it comes to B2C, where your goods is being delivered out to consumers and individual consumers. What is the incentive for them to do the returning? Because the packaging is a reusable one. So this is where the challenge really comes in. So in terms of recycling, there is a easy pathway, because what companies can do is to engage in terms of educating consumers on their role, on whether is it to recycle or how to recycle, right? Or whether to educate the consumers whether the packaging type that they are holding on can be recycled. Companies can also start working with industries like packaging designers or packaging manufacturers to work out a more recyclable products. So these are actually quite easy wins for companies and it's relatively straightforward to implement. However, it will be a bit more difficult in terms of ensuring that the packaging material is recyclable. So you would have to now take a closer look at what is your material that you're using in your packaging. Are they considered recyclable? And whether there are actually different components, different materials that made up of one packaging type. Can those be easily separated? Because different materials have to be separated before they can be recycled. So of course, again, if it is a recyclable one, what is the incentive for the consumers to do the recycling? And whether is it frictionless and convenient for the consumers to do the recycling? I'll actually touch a bit more on the recyclability part in my later slides. So here I will touch first on what is meant by using a recycled content and why it can be considered as part of a 3R plan. So here I have in my diagram a life cycle analysis and a life cycle of a material. You can see that the material's life cycle actually starts from a raw material extraction and then followed by a production. And then you need to transport it to where it's being filled up or being used, and of course eventually reaching the consumer, and eventually when the consumer has finished using the product, the packaging will then become a waste, and what happens to it at the end of life. So this is a whole life cycle analysis of a material. And actually what I've shown here is just really for illustration. Actually every stage of a material's life cycle, both resources and emissions are being involved, because you need energy, you need some kind of water usage to do the production, to do the extraction, and at the end of it, there's some kind of emission, whether it's a greenhouse gas emission or sometimes even a toxicity concern during the end of life. So at this point, you realize that I do not use the word plastics, because at every material, whether it's plastic, paper, or even aluminum, have an impact on the environment. And this is where we have to look at the whole life cycle as a whole, because otherwise, what happened is that for the consumers, there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of a material's impact, because for us as a consumer, we are very focused on the end of life. So because this is where we are nearest, we have just finished using the product and then now we're going to throw it, and then that's where we start wondering and looking at the package, can I recycle this? So, but the thing is that there are some materials that has a higher impact at the raw material production stage, but not so much at the end of life. And this is where the imbalance many misconception comes in, because not the material's overall life cycle is not being considered. So this is where we actually have to look at the whole life cycle in as an overall. So how does having a recycled content in your packaging material helps? So as you can see that, in a life cycle, we do take in consideration the raw material extraction. But then if your packaging is actually recyclable and the consumer does bring it to a recycling bin, what happens is that once it is being collected, the recycling takes place, this actually goes up directly back to the production stage. And this is what we meant by closing the loop in a circular economy. We ensure that the material is being circulated a few more times as a product, rather than going back to the raw material, which is being burned or being landfill. So as you can see, because one stage of the life cycle of the material has been being avoided. So this is where you can help to ensure that the production, the overall life cycle and life cycle of the material is being lowered. So the impact to the environment is actually lowered. So this is how having recycled content as much as possible helps in lowering your impact of your packaged product. So let's look at the recyclability. So having recycled content is very important, but when it comes to recyclability, this is where there's also a lot of misconception, because I think right now for the packaging designers or the packaging manufacturers, the focus is really based on the functionality only, which is actually really very important because the basic function of a packaging is to hold a product, to be compatible with the product, to protect the product, and of course to preserve the product. And in terms of food packaging, for example, this is even more important because this is where you have to ensure that the food gets preserved for as long as possible. Otherwise, food waste itself is also another greenhouse gas emission, another impact to the environment. So this is not wrong, but however, there is a kind of gap in terms of the communication between the production designers at this production stage and with the recyclers at the end of life stage. I'm sure that by bridging the communications between the recyclers, understanding what is the recycling scheme, the recycling facilities is doing, the designers can incorporate these considerations very well into their design and ensure that their packaging product can have a high potential in terms of recyclability. So the thing that I also want to highlight before I end off is that what is recyclable in one country may not be recyclable in another country. This is because in different countries, they have different recycling facilities, their capabilities is different, the technologies that they're using is also very much different. So when the product will eventually be used and disposed will then have to come into consideration. So this is where I would like to stop and highlight, and I hope hopefully anyone in the audience who are packaging designers or manufacturers will initiate that conversation with the recyclers and truly close the loop and ensure that the packaging material gets used a few more times before it actually gets landfilled or incinerated. And that's all I have to share with you today. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Jazlyn and I will then take any questions that you have from the audience now. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. So sorry for any technical complications that you experienced earlier. I hope that the session by Jazlyn and also Yvonne was very informative. We have received quite a number of questions as well. We'll just get right into it. Okay. So first, for Jazlyn, there's a question that asks how much of the plastics that households segregates and collected by the city councils is recycled, either in Malaysia or any other countries around Southeast Asia. And maybe you can also give a comparison if you have that data as well.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing the questions. Actually, we do not have very specific data in terms of how much of the recyclables that have been collected in Malaysia and how much is the volume in terms of the recyclable materials that have been collected from the households. I can share with everyone, what I can share with everyone is that packaging waste is actually the second highest among the general waste. So the first highest ratio of waste would be food and organic waste if you're talking about Malaysia. And this is also applicable to other Southeast Asia countries as well. But of course, when you talk about recyclable, what sort of recyclable materials that have been collected by the waste management operators in most of the Southeast Asia countries are usually the plastic packaging, glass, for example, paper materials. But the highest recycling rate for the packaging would be mostly for paper materials. Unfortunately, for plastic material, the recycling rate is still pretty low in all the Southeast Asia countries, including Malaysia as well. So for Malaysia, for example, even though we have quite a good advanced recycling capacity for different types of plastic types in Malaysia. So some of the recycling companies based in Malaysia, they are also able to process flexibles or even plastic materials like LDPE or even PVC or even polystyrene. However, most of the feedstock that the recycling companies receive are actually from commercial and even industrial sector. So not so much of the recyclable materials, the flexible recyclable materials from household post-consumer waste, unfortunately. So the main reason is because most of the flexible packaging from household are actually highly contaminated with other general waste.
Yes, yeah, I remember you mentioning that in your presentation. So like as a follow-up as well, there's also another question that is talking about the household waste, and especially when focusing on EPR, you mentioned there's not so much focus on the flexibles on the household as well. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of efforts around that area, whether it's coming from the governments in order to tackle on that issue, whether it's through like education or any other ways as well. What do you think about this? Would this like cause a barrier in terms of achieving like EPR, or do you have any like recommendations or suggestions as well?
In order for us to achieve higher recycling rates, not only for plastic packaging, that's for sure, because here we also talk about other packaging materials as well, even for paper, glass, aluminium materials. We always encourage for reduction. And also because of the increasing consumption rate and the waste generation in some of these Southeast Asia countries, especially during the COVID situation, where most of the consumers opt for, deliveries, food deliveries, and other delivery services as well. That is when the packaging generation has spiked. That is also when our existing waste management system is unable to keep up to collect all the waste, the packaging generated in the country, and also to process it. So in order for us to achieve or even to transition to circular economy, that is when we will try to push forward for a mandatory extended producer responsibility scheme to be implemented in each of the countries in Southeast Asia. So not only that the producer have to be assigned more responsibility when it comes to managing the post-consumer packaging in their products, we also need to have government to come in as well to regulate or even to govern the whole EPR scheme implementation. And of course, as a consumer, we always talk about reduction. So try to use less, refuse. And of course, in order for recycling companies to be able to process or even to have good recycling materials, that is when we also need to practice waste segregation as well in order to avoid any contamination, especially to recyclable materials. Not only to plastic materials, this is also applicable to other materials like paper materials as well.
Yes, yeah, agree. And also, I think you also mentioned like in order for EPR to be implemented, we require like the togetherness and also like the contribution from all different parties as well. So what would be your advice to SMEs in subscribing to EPR, since that they account for in Malaysia 98% of the businesses in Malaysia? Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to implementation of EPR in any countries in Southeast Asia, there's always one key concern that have been raised by most of the key stakeholders. That is when we talk about the involvement of SMEs to be part of the EPR implementation. So we always encourage bigger companies or even bigger local companies to be the front end or to be the leaders to actually shift the whole industry towards circular economy first, and then from there, some of the small to medium enterprises will be able to learn from some of the bigger companies in terms of what would be the stepwise approach that they can implement or they can even adopt to transition to a circular economy. So of course, WWF, we have been working with very closely with the government as well in order to see how we can further support SME to be involving in the EPR discussions moving forward as well, because that is also what I would like to encourage the SMEs, not only in Malaysia, to be more active to participate in the EPR discussion, to actually stir the direction of EPR implementation in a very specific country. Because your voice will actually help us to, shape the whole EPR scheme that is more feasible for country specific. For example, in Malaysia. So moving forward, we'll be very keen to engage with most of you moving forward when it comes to the EPR discussions with the government moving forward.
Yes, definitely. Our participants are made up of from different backgrounds, from different sectors, SMEs, corporates, and brands. If you would like to, have a consultation with Jazlyn, you can fill in the form later that I'll be sharing during the break. And you can also reach out to Jazlyn as well for any kind of suggestions on implementation. So I have a question here for Yvonne. So this is specific towards the context of Singapore. Are alternatives of plastics really better than the use of plastics themselves?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think this is really not a very straightforward question to answer, because I mean, first and foremost, we need to understand that, you know, when it comes to packaging, what is the functionality that, you know, we have to fulfill? Because I mean, every packaging is there to serve a purpose. Whether is it just to protect the product, or is it to prolong and preserve the, especially in terms of food, you know, the kind of shelf life it needs. So I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, we really need to look at, I mean, the packaging designers right now has always been looking at the functionality in the beginning, and that cannot be changed. And so because of that, because of the different kind of packaging types that we have, that's really quite difficult to say that, you know, plastics is or is not the best or is the worst. You know, it's not so outright. So we have to take that into considerations. We have to take also things like how is it being manufactured, and also like things like whether is it recyclable. A lot of such factors into considerations before we can know whether plastics is or not, like, you know, the best. But like I mentioned in the my presentation as well, when we look at materials, in general, all materials, when they are in the when you can recycle them and you use a recycled material, the impact to the environment would always be lower, would generally be lower because of what I've already explained. So that could give us a kind of a very general but good overview. So saying that, you know, if somehow for another, you know, you really need to use plastics because of the properties of the plastics is really necessary for that function, for that application, then we can explore whether we can incorporate some kind of recycled plastics as high as possible into that packaging. And then in that way, we can help to ensure the circular economy, because there needs to be a supply and demand. You know, we can always ask people to recycle, but if there's no use for a recycled plastics, for example, then there will also be no market, no need to collect that plastics for recycling. So we to ensure really a closed loop system, have some kind of recycled content in the packaging material.
Okay. So yeah, I just have one last question from one of the people that asked the question. So they mentioned that, you know, since you mentioned that Singapore has also like an appropriate waste management system, and plastic waste doesn't really get into the environment, should they still like recycle plastic or use them as fuel or incineration, for example? What do you think?
I think we really need to start shifting everyone's mindset into circular economy. So I think waste collection, the efficiency and all that, I think that is necessary for, you know, it's a very basic necessity for all types of like waste that we generate as human beings. But I think when it comes to circular economy, what we are trying to educate people right now is that, you know, every material has an impact to the environment. And we want to make sure that, you know, we use it and we use it well. And once we have, you know, used the product, the packaging product, it has finished its, you know, functionality or even its shelf life, we want to be ensured that, you know, it can be recycled or, you know, comes back, close the loop, and then continue being that material rather than just being incinerated. Because I mean, incineration is one way, one of the waste disposal methods. It has to be there for certain products of certain materials that really cannot be recycled, for example, or it has really exhausted all means of other treatment methods. But then it should not be the main disposal methods, let's put it that way. So because if a product it can be recycled, say for example, a paper carton or even the PET bottles, they are so recyclable, then they should be recycled. And then only then we can ensure that, you know, that circular economy, ensuring that, you know, the materials does not get wasted and just being burned or lie in the landfill and not being used again.
All right. Thank you so much, Yvonne, and thank you so much, Jazlyn, for answering the questions. I understand there's still quite a number of questions that you guys have submitted. Jazlyn and Yvonne will try their best to answer their questions through the chat. And after this, we're going to be going for a short break, and there will be a screen that will be coming up with Jazlyn and Yvonne's for WWF Singapore and WWF Malaysia's how to contact them and how to get in touch with them. So yeah, do reach out to them, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.